Good afternoon on a beautiful, beautiful day when you have all made the wise choice. The power of it inside, and I commend your good judgment. My name is Victoria Brown, and I get to introduce Leda Hoffmann today. Always, of course, begin by saying it's my pleasure to introduce so. And sometimes we mean it, and sometimes we don't mean it as much. But oh, do I get it this time. It is so much my pleasure to introduce Leda Hoffmann today to present her map on establishing some rule. And it's my pleasure to introduce her because it has been so much my pleasure to work with her on this project this semester. I would say that Leda Hoffmann has been the brightest light on this semester and quite an important graduation. And I appreciate it, and my doctor appreciates it. Without further ado, let me introduce Leda Hoffmann, which you all know is a theater major and an unofficial history major.
Thanks. So today we're here to talk about self-governance. And I spent my semester looking at the history of self-governance in Grinnell. Pete Brown and I started out talking about the idea of looking at Grinnell in the 60s. And like most people, I thought that self-governance started in the 60s. And so I said, hey, why don't we go and look at the history of self-governance? Topical topic. That we should really, I set out to figure out where does self-governance come from, what are the structures that give us self-governance, and to find out where we are now. I spent the semester talking to all sorts of different students about what self-governance means to them, where they think self-governance comes from. I talked to Wally Walker, who was Dean of Students in the 60s. George Drake, I talked to him about being a student before the 60s and then being president after it. Kind of, where does that come from? I've spent a whole lot of time reading through the S&Bs, reading through old college bulletins, college catalogs, yearbooks, memos, files in the archives. Just keep digging through SGA files, trying to figure out where does this elusive self-governance come from. And so before I started this semester, over the past 4 years, people have basically told me that self-governance comes from this idea that in the 60s, people went off to Vietnam, and Vietnam veterans came back to campus and said, hey, we don't want to be treated like kids. Self-governance. This was actually the story that I told on my tour. I was a tour guide the past 2 years. And that was the story that I told everybody. What I figured out this semester is that that is not true. And that really self-governance has been around forever. Grinnell was founded back in 1846 on the principles of social responsibility and the idea that students should learn from governing themselves. I have specific sources that talk about the idea of self-government, self-governance, whatever you want to call it, back to the 1880s. George Gates, who was inaugurated as the president of the college in 1887, says in his inaugural address, "It is better that the young people should learn to govern themselves." The college bulletin, which is the same thing as the catalog in that year, says, "All honor attaches to self-government, and self-respect can be secured only by faithfulness and diligence to promoting one's own and the common welfare in student life as in the state." The same bulletin really outlines the importance of self-governance at an educational institution. Throughout history, we really get this idea that because students are here to learn, we have to have self-governance because that's how we can learn about ourselves and go off into the big world. The bulletin says in 1917, "The aim of the administration of college government is to lead all students to regard themselves as responsible for good order. The training in self-government is considered no small part of the value of college education." So when we first get the dorms built in 1915, the college established dorm councils and set up a system that looks a lot like the self-governance we have today. There are dorm presidents. There's the Women's League and the Council Hall presidents, which are the governance structures for the dorm. So every dorm has its own president, its own kind of like essays on each floor that are in charge of deciding collectively what the rules should be. And student government by dorm remained strong throughout the early part of the 20th century. President Maine is talking in 1928, and he said, "House government has been firmly established. By natural development through the house groups, self-government has grown to be the established order for the entire student body. The Grinnell idea has always been to develop in its students the consciousness of community responsibility. I found another paper in the archives by a student who graduated in the 1980s, and he writes about the development of self-governance between 1900 and 1945. So that's kind of the border period that I chose to look at. And his thesis is that over these years, there's a development of a democratic self-governing student body which is more representative and independent. And so we kind of see throughout this whole period that students are increasing the way in which they should govern themselves and just continue to assert the fact that we as Grinnellians love self-governance. And so this system works, generally speaking. The administration and the students share the same ideas about what the rules should be. Throughout this period, faculty, administration, and students are in continual dialogue about what rules should be. There's the idea of in loco parentis, the idea that the college should act in place of the parent. And students generally agree that yes, this is actually a very good idea and that we want to be helped and guided. And the idea of in loco parentis and the idea of self-governance can exist in the same college perfectly harmoniously. It's not really a big problem because students and the administration have the exact same ideas about what student life should be like. And this kind of takes place until we get to the 60s. So there was homogeneity in the views across campus, and everyone buys into this dominant moral code. Problems arise when students and administrations have differing ideas. So just a little bit of more specific background on the setup of dorm life. South Campus is built in 1915, North Campus is built in 1917, and basically from that point until the 60s, the general governance structure of the dorm remains basically the same. Men live on North Campus, women live on South Campus, as well as Student Senate, which is basically the same as SGA and Joint Board. There's also the Council of Hall Presidents and the Association of Women Students. And these governing bodies decide and enforce the rules of the dorm. Take your minds back to 1917, in which I found a report by the Dean of Women that kind of outlines what this women's governance body does. And she calls it a self-governing body. This report and the college bulletins for the 1910s outline the regulation of hours, activities, and social functions, and the responsibility of this women's league. Students decided on their own curfews, their own social activities, and things like dress code for eating in quad. You definitely had to wear skirts. And the bulletin in 1917 said, the Dean of Women cooperates with the league, giving it to the benefit of her advice and experience. In addition, stands ready to handle for it whatever cases of discipline may be referred to her by the executive board. So you have this idea that the Dean of Women and the Hall and the Women's Council are working together. They like the fact that she's kind of there as a house mother figure, and that they're always in dialogue with each other. So then we get to the 60s. In 1966, where kind of my 3-year story starts, we're at a situation where women have specific curfews. Security comes and locks the loggia doors on South Campus so that women, or men, I guess, cannot get in or out of the dorms. If you don't make it back by curfew, you have to go all the way around, come through the door in Maine and sign in, and you get detention later. But that the students are the people who are regulating these rules. There's actually a proposal that goes to the Student Senate in February of '66, in which the Women's Board says, hey, I actually think we should lock the doors on the loggia earlier so that we can have just the main door locked at the bottom so that we have a really fair and strict curfew so that at least we're administrating the rule fairly. So that students themselves are trying to figure out how to enforce this rule.